We're beginning a new book this evening. We'll be in the book of Esther, so if you're not already open there, let's turn to Esther chapter 1. We'll be looking at chapters 1 and 2 this evening, and also some brief introductory material. We don't have a lot of time to introduce the book, but we'll look at some of that as well. Our study of the book of Esther will take us through the end of this trimester, through the end of April, and I believe starting in May, we'll start in the book of Isaiah. Just a note for those who are normally in my class, we will be back in there next Wednesday, and I'm assuming Sunday is too as well. Kevin will be back there, so Dad will be back here and things will be back to normal. So we'll go back to our classroom starting Sunday. So we're beginning the book of Esther. We're going to look at, like I said, some introductory stuff. I want to start off by giving us the setting kind of on a timeline, and I don't know if Dad has showed this timeline to you. I know the font is kind of small, so you might have difficulty seeing this. But the book of Esther, we're actually, even though this is the next book sequential after Nehemiah, we just finished Nehemiah and now we're going into Esther, we're actually going back in time. We're backing up about a period of about 50 years. So you have this first return that we had under Zerubbabel here at 536 BC. I think I've zoomed in too much. I can't even really see here. So 536 BC here. The second return took place under Ezra, 458 BC here. The book of Esther fits in between those. In fact, if you'll back up to, just hold your finger here and let's go back to Ezra chapter 6. Ezra chapter 6, in verse 15, this is where the rebuilding of the temple was completed. It says, "Now the temple was finished on the third day of the month of Adar, which is in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius." You might have written out to the side, I know I mentioned this to my class, but that's at 516 BC at Ezra chapter 6 in verse 15. If you jump over to Ezra chapter 7 in verse 9, are really verse 7, Ezra 7 and verse 7. It says, "And some of the children of Israel, the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, the Nethinim, came to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes." That was roughly 458 BC. So we have a period of almost 60 years between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7, about 58 years, I believe, between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. It's in that time frame that we can fit the book of Esther in. So even though we're going to the next book in sequential order, we're actually going back in time. I believe when we ended last week, when we completed Nehemiah, we were around 433. Sorry? Which number? Yeah, I've said a lot of numbers. 458 BC was in chapter 7, Ezra chapter 7 and verse 7. So we're backing up for about 50 years from where we left off last week at the end of Nehemiah. And we'll say more about the date here in just a minute. So just some introductory material. Again, we don't have time to spend a lot of time introducing the book because we have to cover chapters 1 and 2 tonight. So we have a lot to get to here. Starting off, if I can get my notes not to stick together. The author of the book. In short, we don't know who the author was. There's some ideas and some suggestions that have been made. A lot of Jewish history says the men of the great synagogue. Now, if I were to tell you anything about the men of the great synagogue, I'd have to make it up. So I don't know anything at all about the men of the great synagogue, but according to some Jewish tradition, they say that's the author of the book. Some say Ezra and Nehemiah obviously would fit into that time frame. Some even suggest Mordecai, who is one of the main characters in the book, as being the author. But the short answer is we don't know for sure with 100% accuracy who the author of the book is. The date, which I just tried to point out to you on that timeline, seems to fit somewhere between the first and second returns. Again, that first return under Zerubbabel, 536 BC. Second return under Ezra was 458 BC. Again, that seems to fit between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. Just some dates of some things that take place in the book. We're going to begin by talking about King Hazarus, or King Xerxes, tonight. He reigned from 485 BC to 465 BC. We're going to study about Vashtai, Queen Vashtai being dethroned tonight. That was around 483 BC. Esther becomes queen, the queen of Persia, at 478 BC. And then we're going to see Haman's plot. I believe that's in next week's lesson. Haman's plot against the Jews around 473 BC. So those are just some of the dates of different events that we see throughout the book. The setting, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 tells us the setting. If you look in verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus," and you may have a footnote that says Xerxes. This was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days, the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne, and his kingdom, which is in Shushan, the citadel. Now, this is the Persian Empire, this kind of pink or reddish shaded area here. The Persian Empire around 400 BC, so roughly around this time. You see circled here Susa, that would have been the capital where the palace was. So the opening scene here in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, that's where that takes place. All the way from Ethiopia all the way over to India. So quite a vast area that is covered by the Persian Empire here. So much different than, even though it fits the same time frame of Ezra and Nehemiah, it's different in the sense that most of Ezra and Nehemiah are focusing on the Jews in Jerusalem and what they're doing to rebuild Jerusalem. This is focusing on a Jew, Esther, but she's not in Jerusalem. She is still in the Persian Empire and going to become queen, as we'll see tonight in our lesson. So kind of looking at a different angle than what we've seen in Ezra and Nehemiah as well. Some of the main characters that we'll see, and we'll see all of these except this last one in tonight's lesson. King Ahasuerus, that was his Hebrew name. His Greek name was Xerxes. Again, you may have a footnote at verse 1 that says Xerxes. Esther, she was a Jewish woman who becomes queen and saves the Jews. We have Mordecai, who was the cousin of Esther, and he was also a Jew. Some think that perhaps he somehow worked within the Persian government. We'll perhaps talk a little bit more about that tonight. Don't know that for sure. But Haman, he was the wicked Persian in the king's court, and he is where much of the thrust of the book comes from, as he is trying to annihilate the Jews. And the whole story is of Esther saving the Jews. The circumstance at this time, there would have been about 2 to 3 million, roughly 2 to 3 million Jews scattered throughout the Persian Empire at this time. Again, the first group has already returned, but much of the people have not yet returned, or much of the Jews have not yet returned to Jerusalem. The purpose of the book is to show the Jews' deliverance from extermination. It's to show God's providential preservation, according to J. Sidlow Baxter. God preserves his people through whom the seed, the Messiah, would come. It shows how, through God's providence, he brings up an orphan girl, Esther, brings her to the top of the government in Persia, and it's through her that the Jews are saved from being completely exterminated, showing how God preserved his people through the years. He always promised there to be a remnant, and obviously eventually the Messiah would come through them. We're going to see a lot about providence, God's providence, through the book of Esther. Particularly next week, that'll probably bring this out. But flip over to chapter 4. In chapter 4 and verse 14, if you don't have this already marked, you might mark it as a key verse to the book of Esther. But Mordecai is speaking to Esther, and the last sentence in verse 14, Esther 4 and verse 14, it says, "Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Who knows whether God put you in this place to save these people? So we're going to see a lot about God's providence. The word providence coming from the words pro and video, meaning to see before. It's any activity that arises from foresight. Providence is working within the natural realm and the natural law, where a miracle would be supernatural. Again, we see that in chapter 4 and in verse 14. Irving Jensen summarizes it as this. He says, "It is a story that should inspire Christians today to an increased trust in God, who sovereignly controls world history and preserves his own children," showing how through his providence he protected his people. Just some Interesting things about the book of Esther, things that are not mentioned in the book of Esther that you would think perhaps would be. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. Neither is prayer nor praise or the temple is not mentioned in this book. This book was used by the Jews, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but the Jews called this book Megilloth Esther, and because it was one of the Megilloth scrolls, and it was assigned for reading at Jewish holidays, and it was read at the Feast of Purim. And we'll see the Feast of Purim when we get to chapter 9, as that feast is instituted in Esther chapter 9. It's one of two books that is named after women. That is the book of Esther and the book of Ruth. And those are kind of opposites in the sense that Esther was a Jewish woman who married a Gentile. Ruth was a Gentile woman from Moab who married a Jew. So kind of opposites there. One of two books named after a woman. This is an outline of the book, and we'll look at a couple outlines and we'll get into chapter 1. I like this from Wearsby. This is probably the outline we'll be following in my class. Again, Dad may show you something a little different next week. But he summarizes the book as this is God's providence in protecting his people. Chapters 1 and 2 is Esther's coronation. Chapters 3 through 7 is Haman's condemnation. And chapters 8 through 10 is Israel's celebration. Here's an alternate outline from Roper, who divides it up a little bit differently. He says background, chapters 1 and 2 is when Esther becomes queen. The conflict in chapter 3 is Haman's plot to destroy the Jews. And the resolution, chapters 4 through 8, the Jews are saved by Esther. That's all I have in the way of introduction before we get into chapter 1. Any other comments that you might want to make? All right, we'll get into chapter 1. We've got a lot to cover in chapters 1 and 2. So if you have your questions, somebody give us a summary of chapter 1. What do we see in chapter 1? Okay. Vashtai is disposed. What else? Anybody have anything else to add? Yes. We see great feasts. Two feasts are celebrations that are given by the king. So we see in chapter 1 the dethroning of Queen Vashtai. And, well, I can't find it. I thought I had some notes of Dad's chapter titles. I do. And it's pretty much the same. The king disposes Vashti. I was going to give that for the benefit of those in his class. But the dethroning of Queen Vashti. And this is what's going to lead up to eventually, again, we talked about the point of the book has to do with the Jews basically being saved through Esther. Chapters 1 and 2 kind of sets the scene for us. How did Esther get into the position of being able to save God's people? Well, it's because she became the queen. Well, how did she become the queen? Chapters 1 and 2 are going to tell us events that led up to her becoming the queen. Verses 1 through 4, we're going to see the king's gathering of leaders for a 6-month banquet. Again, we talked about that, the setting given to us in verses 1 and 2. This is in Shushan or Susa, the capital city of the Persian Empire. It says that in verse 3 that in the 3rd year of his reign, and this is talking about Hazarus or Xerxes from verses 1 and 2. So you might make a note out beside verse 3. This is roughly around 482 BC. 482 BC. This is in the 3rd year of his reign. He began his reign around 485 BC. So 482 BC, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast of all of his officials. And what is Ahasuerus doing at this feast? Yeah, that seems to be what he's doing. We're not really told the reason for the feast, but it says that he invited basically all those who were in power in the provinces that were under him. And in verse 4, this is where he's showing off, and he showed the riches. And when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, for 180 days. So roughly a 6-month period is how long this banquet lasted. Just for the purpose, seemingly, we're not told really why he had this banquet, but seemingly to show off all of his riches. Verses 1 and 2 tells us that he ruled over 127 different provinces throughout the kingdom. Again, verse 3, this is around 482 BC. This might suggest to us, this quote here from Roper, why he's having this banquet. Again, the text does not tell us. But he says the purpose of the occasion may have been to plan Xerxes' upcoming campaign against the Greeks. It was roughly around this time, 483, 482 BC, when Xerxes is going to attempt to overtake the Greeks, and he fails in that. But his father, Darius, had attempted to do that back in 490 BC and had failed as well. So perhaps he's gathering all these men in power from all of his provinces, showing them his riches, showing them his power, so that he can go out and attempt to conquer the Greeks, which Persian history would tell us that he fails at doing that at this time. So that seems to be perhaps the purpose of this 6-month banquet that takes place. At the end of that 6 month, beginning at verse 5, we see the king's hosting of a 7-day feast for a citadel in Susha, or Sushan. This is again, the capital city of the Persian Empire. Who does it say was invited to this particular feast or banquet? Yes, those who are present in Shushan, in the citadel or in the palace. Verse 5 tells us from great to small, in the court and in the garden of the king's palace. And again, we're not really told what the purpose of this feast was. He again seems to kind of show off his riches, because verses 6 and 7, it gets very detailed of the things that they would have seen within the citadel or within the palace. It says in verse 6, there were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver cords, marble pillars. The couches were of gold and silver and on mosaic pavement of alabaster turquoise, white and black marble. Verse 7, and they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. So it gets quite detailed in describing things that they would have seen. Roper here says perhaps this might be the reason for that detail. The purpose of these details must have been to illustrate the magnificence of the Persian Empire, to impress the reader with the fact that as great as this empire was, that God is still in control, and that God through his providence is still ruling and going to use this orphaned girl, Esther, and bring her to the throne where she can save God's people. So perhaps that might be the reason. Continuing on in verse 8, talking about this banquet, what was said about the drinks that were served? Yes, in accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered, and all the officers of his household, so that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Basically telling each person more likely what he's telling them is there's no limit on your drink. If you want to go overboard on it, you have the right to do so. Josephus takes a little bit different approach to it. This is, again, from Roper. He says, the Persians were known for their excessive drinking on such occasions. Josephus said it was customary for guests to be brought wine continually at these feasts. Thus, they were normally compelled to drink. And it may be that the guests were even required to drink every time the king would drink. Every time the king took a drink, everyone else had to take a drink. It seems more likely to me what he's telling them is you're allowed to go overboard on your drinking if you want to, because we know they did go overboard on it. We'll see as we get down into verse 10. What's Queen Vashtai doing during this feast? Verse 9. She has, yes, having her own feast. Queen Vashtai made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which also belonged to King Hazarus. So at this time, she's at a separate banquet and a separate feast, not with the king. And that finishes us up down through that section. Verses 10 through 12. The next section here, we're going to see the king's request that he makes of the queen and her refusal. It says, beginning at verse 10, that on the 7th day, here's where we see we know at least some of them went overboard on their drinking. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbonah, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king Ahasuerus. And what does he command these 7 eunuchs to do? Verse 11. Yes. Bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown in order to show off her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. So verse 10, we know at least the king, and we can assume probably most everyone else at the banquet, had too much to drink. He was drunk. The king was drunk in verse 10. The king wanted to show off the beauty of his wife, of the queen, of Queen Vashti. And some have even suggested, and I'm not really sure I buy into this, but when it says that she was to come to this banquet wearing her crown, that he was suggesting to her, you were to wear only your crown. In other words, she was to parade around naked in front of these men, around these drunken men. Not 100% sure that's the case, but nonetheless, it was sexualized in the sense that he was showing off her beauty. And many said that would require her to take off the customary veil that she would have normally worn on her face. So nonetheless, whether she was unclothed or not, it would have been an embarrassing situation for her to be paraded out in front of these drunken men. So what was her reaction when she is requested to come before the king? Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore, here's the reaction of the king. Therefore, the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. A pretty embarrassing situation for the king. Embarrassing situation for both of them, really. But for the king, he's having these banquets showing off his power, how great he is, and his riches. And yet, in all of his power, he couldn't even control his wife. And so that's most likely why he was furious and his anger burned within him. Yes, and we're not told exactly why that reason was. And that leads us into this next slide here. Why did she refuse? Again, I said some had suggested that she parade around naked. Not sure that was the case, but if that was the case, she would have had good reason not to do that. But we're not told simply why she refused. Perhaps she didn't want to stand before a crowd of drunken men, which would be quite understandable, because it was for the purpose of her showing off how beautiful she was. Perhaps because of her modesty, she chose not to stand before these men. Such appearances were usually done by concubines, and perhaps she thought that the request was beneath her status as the queen. And she was also hosting a feast of her own, and perhaps she thought the request from the king was ill-timed. So we're not told. I'm led to believe that she probably was justified in refusing to come, but the bottom line is we're not told why she refused to come, other than she seems to be, the king seems to want to parade her around to show her off. And if that be the reason, she has good purpose not to come. So that takes us down through verse 12. Beginning at 13, we're going to see the king dethrones Queen Vashti because he was embarrassed in front of her, and he became furious because she refused to do what he requested of her. He's going to take counsels from some of his closest counselors in verses 13 through 22, and this is what's going to lead to her being dethroned and eventually make way for Esther to come to the throne herself. It says in verse 13, then the king said to the wise men who understood the times. Some commentators say that probably is reference to astrologers, men who understood the times. They studied the stars. A lot of the kings and rulers and leaders at this time would have consulted astrologers to study the stars, and that's how they based a lot of their rulings and their decisions. So perhaps that's what that's talking about in verse 13, that whoever these men were that says they understood the times. And then some of these men are listed in verse 14. So he asked them in verse 15, what shall we do to Queen Vashti according to the law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? And beginning at verse 16 down through the rest, they're going to give him some advice. And what motivates them in their answer that they give here? Yes. There's some self-interest there in these men and in these advisors. Basically saying that our wives look up to the queen, and they're going to use this example and say, well, the queen did not obey her husband, therefore we don't have to obey our husbands. They basically say if we don't make an example out of Queen Vashti, then all of our wives are going to end up rebelling, is basically what they're saying. Now,
it does seem an interesting perspective that the focus on that, the fact that she disobeyed her husband, rather than the fact that she disobeyed her king, which
Yeah.
would seem to be a more serious offense and should have been more worrying, I would think, to the leaders of the kingdom than the fact that your wife disobeyed you, that you
Right.
had a subject that disobeyed you and the king. But it's interesting that that's their focus.
yeah, seem to be more worried about themselves.
It
Yeah.
makes them seem more human.
Yeah, yeah, very true. So yeah, not only was it her husband, it was the king as well. But their interest, it does seem to be self-interest on their parts. Because in verse 16 it says, then Manukin, one of these advisors, spoke up and he answered before the king and the princes, and he said, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in the province of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior, verse 17, for the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. When they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen, and there will be excessive contempt and wrath. They're worried about all their wives doing the same thing. We have to remember this is a pagan kingdom here. This is not, even though I wouldn't put this past God's people of old, this is talking about a pagan kingdom and how they treated their wives. So they seem to be worried about themselves. So they suggest in verse 19, if it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered. Once a decree went out from the Persian king, it could not be changed. It was irrevocable. That Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all the empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. So they're, again, saying we have to get rid of this queen. We have to dethrone her and make an example out of her. And that's exactly what they do, verses 21 and 22. And the reply pleased the king, and the princes and the king did according to the word of Manukin. And he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak the language of his own people. Take that to mean, that last phrase there, probably that if you were married to a foreign wife, that you speak your language, not the language, don't take on the language of your wife. Basically, the men are to be in control in their households is the point that they're making. So that finishes up, gets us down through the end of chapter 1, as she is dethroned. Yes?
Don't you find it funny that even the pagan decision was better to have a man over the home?
Yeah.
I mean, we have today, that's God's plan.
Right.
Even they realize that without knowing that it's God's plan.
Yeah. Realize there's some significance in having that leadership there. That's true. Very true. Anything else on chapter 1? This basically sets the setting of what brings us up to Esther coming to the queenship. George?
In that verse 19 there, I got a note here, there is the problem passage here. God is not mentioned in this book, but his finger headed toward direction in.
Yeah.
So here, I got that note here.
Yes. Yeah, even though the name of God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, he's definitely seen in the book of Esther his hand working in this. Anything else on chapter 1? Just giving us a background of what led up to Esther becoming queen. Question number 2. Somebody give us a summary of chapter 2. All right, Esther becomes queen. We've just seen the background of what leads up to this. And we're going to see God's hand in chapter 2 as well, of taking. Esther was probably one of the least likely people you would think, being an orphaned girl, and yet she's the one who's going to be chosen to take over this queenship from Vashtai here. So chapter 2, Esther becomes the queen. Verses 1 through 4, we see the king's plan to replace Vashtai. I'm not sure if he regretted his decision, but verse 1 says, "And after these things, when the wrath of King Hazarus subsided, he remembered Vashti." Now, in what sense did he remember her? Is he missing her? Is he wanting her back? I don't know. But we know from chapter 1 and verse 19 that when that decree went out that she was to be dethroned, it was irrevocable. He could not bring her back even if he wanted to. But perhaps in chapter 2 and verse 1, he's regretting his decision. It just said he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. And then again, the king's servants or his advisors are going to come to him, and what are they going to suggest to him in the next few verses there? Verses 2 through 4. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, he wanted to parade Vashti before all these men, and now he's gathering women from all over the kingdom and going to parade them before the king, and he's going to choose which one pleases him the most to become his queen. You might make note that roughly about 4 years have passed between chapters 1 and chapters 2. It's thought that during that time period is when King Hazarus was trying to overthrow the Greeks and failed in that. But nonetheless, we know 4 years have passed because chapter 1 and verse 3, we mentioned that was around 482 BC. You might jump down to chapter 2 and verse 16. It says, "So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into the royal palace in the 10th month, which is in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign." That's roughly 478 BC. So you might write that out to the side of chapter 2 and verse 16. 478 BC. So roughly 4 years have passed between chapters 1. Really, 3 years have passed between chapters 1 and 2 because it's going to be a year of preparation for these women before they come before the king. But again, 3 or 4 years have now passed between chapters 1 and 2. So they suggest that women throughout all the provinces, we're going to select the most beautiful women from the province, and they're going to be paraded before the king. And this, it says at the end of verse 4, "This thing pleased the king, and he did so." Verses 5 through 14, next section, Haggai, not the prophet Haggai, spelled differently. Haggai shows preference to Esther in verses 5 through 14. We're going to see that Mordecai, this is the first time we're introduced to Mordecai, who was the cousin of Esther. And he's going to introduce him first before we see about Esther. It says in verse 5, "In Shushan the citadel there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah." You may have a footnote there in verse 6 that says Jehoiakim or Jehoiachin. This was the king who was in control. In 2 Kings chapter 24, he was a vassal king under Nebuchadnezzar had basically overtaken them by that point, and he had a vassal king that was King Jehoiachin in the southern kingdom. And it was during that time when this man Kish, who was the great-grandfather of Mordecai. So it's just showing that Mordecai, the descendants or the ancestors of Mordecai were ones who were taken captive and brought to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar himself. Verse 7 is when we are first introduced to Esther. It says, "Then Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, so she was an orphan. The young woman was lovely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai, who was her cousin, took her as his own daughter." We see her name here The name Esther means star. Here's what I was trying to get. Esther is likely derived, it's her Persian name likely. It's a word meaning star. Her other name, Hadassah, was probably her Hebrew name, meaning myrtle. The verse 7 in some translations says that she was beautiful of form and face. The ESV says that she had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. So she was very beautiful woman, and that's what they were seeking out, right? They were looking for beautiful women for the king. In verses 8 through 14 is when she finds favor with this Haggai. Now, he was the one who was in charge over the king's harem. He was in charge over the women in the king's harem. And she is going to find favor. We see more of God's providence here. How did this orphan girl become queen? Well, first off, she was chosen because she was beautiful. Another thing is she found favor in this guy's sight, in Haggai's sight. Verse 8, it says, "So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women." Now, verse 9, here's where we see his preference that he shows towards her. It says, "Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. And 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not yet revealed her people or her family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it." So she found favor in the sight of this man named Haggai, who was in charge over the king's harem. She was taken into his care. She was given special privileges in verse 9 that the other women were not given. They were given evidently a certain allotment of beauty preparations in verse 9, and he gave her extra. He gave her above the allotment or above the allowance, as it says in verse 9. He gave her choice maidservants. He gave her a choice place in the house. He's showing preference towards her. Again, showing how was she chosen out of all the 127 provinces that this king was over. How fortunate is it that this Esther was chosen? Well, this kind of helps her out. She's given preference by this man who's basically a right-hand man to the king. And that's what's going to lead her to becoming queen. Verse 10, we read verse 10. She did not reveal that she was a Jew, because most likely that would have just ended her place in the contest, if you want to call it that. By that point, they found out she was a Jew. She would have probably been eliminated. Mordecai was able to keep an eye on her. And we see this several times, and we'll see it even in next week's lesson as well. And Mordecai is in close proximity with the palace. And that's what leads some to believe that perhaps Mordecai himself was some sort of government official. But verse 11 says, "And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn Esther's welfare and what was happening to her." He was keeping an eye on her. He was her adopted father, I guess you could say, but he was her cousin. He was trying to keep an eye on her. But if you jump down to verse 19, at the end of verse 19, it says, "Mordecai set within the king's gates." And we're going to see that more. We'll see that in next week's lesson as well, that Mordecai sat within the king's gates. It's for that reason that a lot of people think he must have been some sort of government official. And perhaps he was, but we're not told that. But maybe that's why he had such a close, he was able to be in such close proximity and keep an eye on Esther. Verse 12, this preparation took about 12 months. What does it say in verse 12? Their preparation was apportioned at the end of verse 12, 6 months with oil and myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying. So again, between chapters 1 and 2 is about 3 years. Then they took a year of preparation. And then when we get down to verse 16, that's around 478 BC. Verses 13 and 14, it just basically tells the process that they're going to go through. Each woman is going to be paraded before the king, and it's quite literally a beauty contest. He's looking at them physically, how he's physically attracted to them. Each one of them spent the night with the king and went home the next morning and explains that process there in verses 13 and 14. Picking up in verse 15, we see that Esther, it's going to be her turn now to go before the king. And this is what we'll see how it is that she is chosen. Esther is chosen to be queen, verses 15 through 18. And here's one reason. We already talked about the preference that this Haggai had given towards her. He'd given her, back in verse 9, the extra beauty preparations. He'd given her a special place. He'd given her special servants. So he had already shown preference towards her. But look at verse 15. It says, "Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised." So he had evidently given her some sort of inside information, if you will, of here's what you can do that's going to impress the king so that he will choose you. So she took his advice, whatever that advice was. We're not told what that was. She took and did what he advised, and Esther, at the end of verse 15, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Hazarus, verse 16, into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is in the 10th month of Tebeth. I believe that corresponds to roughly our present day December, January. In the 7th year of his reign, again, that's around 478 BC, roughly 4 years after Vashtai had been dethroned. And she is going to find favor in his sight. Verse 17, she's made queen, and we're going to see what he does in verse 18 to celebrate that. It says in verse 17 that the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so he set the royal crown upon her and made her queen instead of Vashti. Verse 18, here's the celebration of the new queen. It says, "Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all the officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday." Some translations, I think the ESV says that he remitted their taxes during this time. Sounds like a pretty good holiday. He made a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king, celebrating this new queen who has been put on the throne here in 478 BC. Anything else down through verse 18? Bell's going to catch us here. I do want to read this because we see God's hand. The whole purpose of these first two chapters is to show us how she got to be queen, but we see God's hand in that. This from Roper, he says, "The plot of the story has therefore completed its first stage of development. As Queen, Esther was now in a position to save the people when they were threatened with extermination. Any reader might be amazed by the fortunate but unlikely coincidences that elevated this orphan girl to the throne. However, a more biblical response is to see the circumstances, the guiding hand of God who was working providentially to accomplish his purposes. How unlikely that an orphaned girl, orphan Jew, would come to be queen in the Persian Empire, the most powerful empire in the world at that time. We certainly see God's hand in that. Bell's going to catch us here. But this last section, verses 19 through 23, Mordecai discovers a plot. Again, we already pointed out in verse 19, he was sitting within the king's court, or within the king's gate in verse 19. He hears two men talking. Mordecai does in verse 21. "In those days while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, and they're listed Bigthan and Teresh, they were doorkeepers, and they became furious, and they sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus." In other words, they're going to kill him. They wanted to assassinate the king. And Mordecai ends up telling Esther about it. Esther ends up telling the king, and these men are eventually killed. Now, something interesting, one thing is that this is not something was not uncommon during that time period. But historians say that this king later died from a similar plot around 465 BC, that he eventually was assassinated. But this was a plot that was foiled by Mordecai at this time. And we're going to see more plots that are foiled by Ezra and Mordecai. And that's going to be the main point of the book of Esther. We'll see that next week in chapters 3 and 4. Anything else on chapter 3? 7:45 according to my watch. All right, we'll stop there. Again, Dad will be back next week. We'll look at Esther chapters 3 and 4.